to our Greenbag lunch series on microplastics and plastic pollution. My name is Alina Bugas. I am a senior here at the college, majoring in marine biology and minoring in environmental studies and archaeology. I've been working at the Office of Sustainability and have been researching microplastics here at the college for a year and a half now. I started at the office as a rotation intern working with the zero waste and social media initiatives, and I am now a project leader for the 71%, which I will talk about in a minute. This event is zero waste, which means that 90% or more of the resources from this event will be diverted from the landfill. All the cups, plates, silverware, and food can be composted, which you can bring over to Sarah, who is in the back. The food provided today is also locally sourced through Grow Food Carolina. So this year, my co-leader and I started a new project at the office, which focuses on oceanic conservation and awareness, with the hope that this will help reduce human impact on our local waterways. Our project is called the 71% because 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, and all of our actions impact every drop of that. Last semester, we started off by focusing on the topic of sustainable seafood, and this semester we are focusing on microplastics and plastic pollution in our oceans, we'll be discussing today. We are very excited to feature these great panelists for our first Greenbag lunch series of the semester, and today our moderator will be Isabel Swee. Isabel is the co-leader of the 71%, who is also a senior at the college majoring in business administration and minoring in studio art. This is Isabel's fourth semester at the office. Previously, she was a volunteer at our Greek chair and Goddard research programs, and then became a rotation intern working with the social media, zero waste, and residence life initiative. Please help me welcome my good friend Isabel Swee.
Hello everyone, and thank you Alina for that great introduction. I am so honored to be moderating this event and cannot wait to hear what these amazing panelists and the audience have to contribute to the topic of microplastic. Today's discussion will begin with a brief video introducing microplastics, followed by each panelist elaborating on the topic. Then I will ask a couple of questions, ending with opening the discussion to the audience. We have three panelists with us today. First is Leah Colabello, Director of Global Partnership and Community Engagement for the Five Dryers Institute. Next to her is Kia Payton, Marine Biology graduate student here at the College of Charleston. And lastly, we have Abby Wenzel, who is MS and PhD candidate in Marine Biomedicine and Environmental Science at MUSC. Thank you all for being here today. So first, here is the video briefly outlining microplastic. Great. Now we will start with Leah giving an overview of plastic pollution.
Thank you, Isabel. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Back. Hi. Nice to meet you. My name is Leah Colabello, and I'm with the Five Gyres Institute. Our organization is one of the premier researchers of the global distribution of plastic on the high seas. We've released 9 reports, taken 16 expeditions all around the world, transecting oceans to understand the scope of the issue. And today I'm going to share with you some of our findings. The reports have come out now that 8 million metric tons of plastic pollution are coming down our watersheds all around the world. We have found 5.2 trillion pieces of plastic in the high seas, and I'm going to go ahead and send these samples around so you can see what plastic pollution looks like, because when plastic gets out there, it isn't like a water bottle floating around. It's been disintegrated into tiny, tiny little pieces that are smaller than a grain of rice. Okay, if you want to pass it around. You'll see the location on the top of where these were found. There's so many problems with plastic pollution in the oceans, but one of the things that Abby is going to speak about a little bit later is that plastics act like a sponge. That is, they grab onto persistent organic pollutants that are floating out there, and then they become quite toxic. And when fish ingest plastic, the toxins are now been demonstrated by science to leave the plastic particle that's in the fish's stomach and be absorbed into the fish's flesh. This is a map that's a little dated now, but it describes the scale of plastic pollution. A lot of you might be wondering, what's a gyre? How do you even pronounce it? Gyre, gyre. A gyre is actually the heart of the sea. It's where high pressure builds up and the currents and the winds start to stall out. Thus, all the plastic sort of gathers to the Coriolis effect of, well, you guys are smart kids, oceanography 101 stuff. But what we're seeing here, and I'll just get a little closer to this. Here, it doesn't look so bad off the United States. That's our gyre, the North Atlantic gyre. But if you look off of China, 80% of plastic pollution going to the oceans comes from Asia. Why is that? Well, it's because in the US and other developed countries, we have a recycling and waste collection rate of about 70%, where in countries like Southeast Asia, I mean, that's a watershed right there. That's water. That's not a landfill. It's just conveyor belts of plastic are floating out into the ocean. And this is the experience that we're leaving for generations of our children, to swim and play in plastic pollution like this. This young man, he's a waste picker, kind of an indicator of the value of plastic, and I could give a whole lecture on the value of plastic in developing economies. But he's sitting in a boat. That's a boat. So what we call this is a plastic smog. Basically, our rivers and streams are conveyor belts that are sending plastic particles into the ocean, because a lot of countries just don't have those waste management systems like we do here in the United States to support it. We're going to be releasing a paper talking about a plastic smog, because we want people to understand it's not a garbage patch, like you could step on things or anything like that. It's tiny little particles of carbon that aren't in our air, but they're being shot out into our sea through our watersheds. Abby is going to speak a little bit more about fish and toxicity. That's a 3-month-old fish. It had 17 pieces of plastic in its stomach. We discovered it in one of our earlier, we caught it in one of our earlier expeditions, and it has, we didn't eat it because we knew about plastics and persistent organic pollutants. So that was this kind of a really brief, because I only have a few minutes, scope of the scale of the issue. But how did we get here? It's all about, really, I want to focus the talk today on plastics packaging, because 26% of the plastic that's manufactured today is used in packaging. It started here with cellophane. Cellophane is a precursor to what we now know as polyethylene or polypropylene. It was discovered in Switzerland, or created in Switzerland in 1912. And then DuPont brought it over here in the US. They bought the rights. And cellophane was amazing because you could, A, package your food and have it last fresher for days, because in 1927, DuPont was able to create a moisture-proof barrier. So now your bread didn't have to be from the baker yesterday. It could be a week-old bread and you could still eat it. So this is really important with regards to consumerism and food distribution. Second, you could also see what was inside. That was really catchy. In fact, it was so catchy, within 10 years, cellophane was 1/4 of DuPont's profit margin. It was insanely good. It was insanely amazing for them. Of course, these are really, I mean, these are true ads, touting how beneficial and life-changing plastics were. And indeed they were. Skipping ahead 20 years, this was a story in Life magazine, and it literally reads, "Dear housewife, everything that you can see in this picture would take you 50 hours to wash. But now, because of plastics, you can throw them away. Don't even worry about washing that fork, knife." And that's where it started to come into the mindset where you can have single-use plastics as just a throwaway society. Let's talk about the amount of plastics being produced. This year, you can see, run the numbers down there, but this year we've produced 311 tons of plastic, million metric tons of plastic. That is set to double in the next 20 years and quadruple in the next 40 years. That's a lot of plastic that we're already drowning in. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we talked about wonderful waste management opportunities right here in the US. It seems to work pretty well, but it's not really the answer for emerging countries where they're really just trying to feed their people and take care of health crises. They can't be going to the World Bank and saying, hey, can I have a couple billion to build a recycling facility downstream? We're really focused as an organization at Five Gyres as consumer engagement. You are all familiar with Rethink, Reuse, Recycle, and I'm sure you have a strong supporting role in all that. I personally am a huge advocate, and I work with businesses around the United States to think about different ways to use plastic. Design change. So what you have in front of you, if you've got one of your drinks from the back is, use PLA, corn-based plastics, or something else instead of just regular virgin plastic, something that's part of the plastics economy, which I'll dive into in a minute. Lastly, policy. And I'm going to get to policy in a second, because when you have bag bans in place, you wipe out your plastic problem in a second, and I'll show that to you in a minute. As an advocate, again, design and policy change. This container right here in the upper left-hand corner, that's from Whole Foods. And I know the president of a company that is now manufacturing plastic for every single Whole Foods bar and deli. And you're like, oh, that sounds bad, right? No, it's from 7-Up, recycled 7-Up and Sprite containers, because it's Whole Foods green and Whole Foods really loves it. So now Whole Foods is scaling and investing in this innovator that is doing something called cradle to cradle. He's taking plastics and putting them back in the system. So there's no leakage out into waste collection or into the ocean. Fees and deposit laws. We're going to be looking at a lot of bans here in South Carolina soon. It's going to come up. We'll probably talk about it a little bit later today. But in the US, we have a 35% recycling rate. It's okay, but in states where you get 5 cents, that doubles to 70%. And in states like Michigan, where you get 10 cents per bottle you recycle, it's a 95% recycling rate. So we know that fees like this work. In China, they did a ban in 2008 for plastic bags. Totally unsightly. Obviously, we all can know what plastic bags' impact is on the environment. 40 billion plastic bags were knocked out in a year. That is the power of a ban. France is just enacting a ban this year. Bangladesh enacted the first ban in 2002 because the plastic bags were gumming up their wastewater management systems and leading to horrific flooding. One of the things that global organizations are looking at right now are something called the Global Plastics Protocol. How can we manage the trillions of different types of plastic patents that are out there in the world? And how can we look at these 7 types of plastic that's magnified, like in China, this is like blown out of control, and understand what kind of chemicals and plasticizers are going in there, and figure out a way to recover this safely. So we're looking at, again, some kind of policy where there's only going to be 100 pieces of plastic. I mean, they don't have the policy figured out yet, but if everyone only used 100 pieces of plastic and we all knew how to recycle it and put it back into the system, we'd have a great solution and we wouldn't need to keep on creating plastics. Sorry, I'm out of time, so I'm going to just have to skip through this slide very briefly, but right now we have a linear economy, and what we're trying to move towards is a cradle-to-cradle new plastic economy. So if you follow these blue lines here, it's kind of hard to see with the light. It is our current society. We're 90 goes straight into waste collection, or you get leakage into watersheds and oceans. For a cradle-to-cradle mentality, bioplastics are composted. And in the future, all other plastics are cradled out back into the system. We're capturing everything. That's the utopian vision of how we're going to solve the plastic dilemma that we've got. So that's a bit of us. That's a bit about the scope and how we're going to create some solutions for the problem. This is our organization. We're basically known for our research, our global expeditions. Jack Johnson is making a film about the last expedition he was on with us this past summer. And also activism, for example, the microbeads ban. And if you would like to talk a little bit further about those, I'm super happy to stay afterwards. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for that, Leah. Now, Kia, if you would like to talk about what a microplastic is and how they travel through our food webs.
Sure. Unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint or anything like that, but I just kind of want to give you guys a scope of what we're looking at. People think of plastics, like she said, plastic bags and bottles and stuff, but these things break down, and they break down smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where they're the size of a pinhead, or even smaller when you're nano size. And in this case, you need a microscope, a heavy-duty microscope, and the scope gets further and further. And the impacts of that is we don't really know yet. They could absorb chemicals, hazardous chemicals, and then when the sun hits it and releases these chemicals into different organisms. So I just want to give you guys an idea that it starts at a plastic bag, but it doesn't end there. So these small particles, maybe some of you guys have seen a YouTube video of zooplankton, or little small copepods, if you guys are familiar with that. They're little organisms that live out in the ocean and some in our rivers, etc., just right outside our door. They can eat these tiny particles. So the zooplankton eat it, a little bigger fish eats that, a bigger fish eats that, or a crab eats it, or the oysters filter feed and take it in, and then they end up in our systems, or they end up on our dinner plate, as that video in the very beginning showed. And a little bit about my research, I'm looking at microplastics in the Charleston Harbor. So not just everywhere, of course, I'm doing a little survey of what's out there, and there are also people at this college and the Citadel and around us, so everybody could get involved if you wanted to. But we're looking specifically at what's going on locally and in the Charleston Harbor. I'm looking at flood tidal fronts, which is where the river water meets the ocean water, and then that little foam line that forms, and when you drive over the bridge, you can see that little foam line. Some people think it's from a boat or whatever, but this is a potential aggregation point for these plastics. If they're aggregating plastics, they may also be aggregating zooplankton or other organisms that can't really fight the currents that well. So the definition of a plankton is they're at the mercy of the water. So they get trapped in those currents as well. So if all these things are mixing around, then those plastics become more available for consumption. And so those are the things that I'm looking at now. I've gone out on a boat, I've taken water samples, and I'm currently looking through these water samples to see how many microplastics per liter am I really finding. Am I finding them in the guts of these organisms, and how big of an impact are these microplastics actually making on our local environment? And my next step, so she also touched on that fish, and you could see those plastics inside, but I'm looking at plastics that are the size of a pinhead, like I said. So I'm also looking at fish intestines to see if I see any plastics within that range, to kind of give a potential evidence for trophic transfer and see what's going on. And that's pretty much it. It's a lot of work, and I'm still working on it, but hopefully we'll get good data soon. And I know the Citadel is also working on this work as well, looking at both macro-sized plastics and the micro-size. So soon, good data to come.
Great, thank you so much. Now, Abby will describe some of the chemicals found in these microplastics and their potential effects on human health.
Yeah, so can you hear me? I'm soft-spoken. Stand up. So they asked me here because I'm at MUFC and I study phthalates, which are a plasticizer found in personal care products and from dietary exposures. So I don't really study microplastics, but I've done a lot of reading in the past few weeks about them and the potential health effects. And from what I've read in the past few weeks, I have found that this is a topic that is very much in its infancy in relation to public health. And there are way more questions than there are answers. So some of the questions I had when I started reading was, I knew Leah would talk about the scope of plastics, so I learned there's a lot of plastics, microplastics in the environment. But the question becomes, are there negative health effects in these seafoods that we're consuming? And so I found many studies, a lot of studies in oysters, in mussels, and daphnia, and smaller crustaceans, showing that these organisms that contain significant levels of microplastics, which most of them do, you're seeing a lot of really negative reproductive effects. Smaller eggs size, slower moving sperm, fewer, slower growing offspring, to name a few health effects you're seeing. But on the flip side, there's, for every study that shows these kind of effects, there's a study showing that a lot of these microplastics actually absorb a lot of these chemicals that we study. and act as a cleaning effect in some of these organisms. So the data still is pretty ambiguous. I guess I should mention some of these chemicals we're talking about. So many contaminants are hydrophobic, and so they easily absorb onto microplastics. And the release of these like additives or chemicals depends on many factors like pH, the type of the polymer it is, pore size, the size of the chemical, the congener of the chemical. And so a lot of those details really depend on whether chemicals are absorbed more strongly onto the particle or released from the particle. And so some of the chemicals that are associated with microplastics that I kept reading about were bisphenol A, which is very estrogenic and mimics estrogen in our bodies. Phthalates, which I study, which are known to be anti-androgenic, and they inhibit your Leydig cells' ability to synthesize testosterone. Dioxins, which we've probably mostly heard of, which are very carcinogenic. Flame retardants, like the polybrominated diethyl ethers, which affect your thyroid hormone signaling. Perfluorinated compounds, a lot of the flame retardants, like I just said. Nonylphenol, which is in plastics. PCBs, or polyfluorinated biphenyls. I would say a lot of the research that has been done has been on PCBs. They're very persistent, and a lot of indirect evidence has been found linking the amount of plastic in the stomachs of seabirds, is a well-studied one, to increase PCB concentrations in the tissues. And PAH, or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, are also another one that you read about a lot. And so, where am I going with this? Okay, so we eat seafood. I also read that microplastics are in a lot of things like beer. There's actually been a lot of research done that shows we drink a lot of microplastics too, so it's not just seafood. It's in our water, basically. And so we're really unsure what happens once we consume these microplastics. Some studies say that because of their size, it's not very likely that these chemicals or these microplastics are transported across your cellular membranes, but that the place where you might be concerned about is in your gut, because they'll sit in your gut and you might see like local inflammation in your gut. However, these microplastics can be degraded further into nanoplastics, and there has been a lot of study on nanoparticles showing that those do easily cross membranes and can be transported across your body, so that is kind of concern. And then the last point I think I wanted to make is that a lot of these chemicals that I just mentioned are ubiquitous in the environment already. And so another question is how much do the microplastics really add to this source of exposure? I think it is cause for concern. But something I always keep in the back of my mind is that we're exposed to a lot of these chemicals all the time, but something very important is timing of exposure. So a fetus, for example, is very vulnerable to a lot of these chemicals because they're very important for hormone signaling and development. So if you're pregnant or trying to become pregnant, you might want to keep that in the back of your mind. And just as a big picture, I read an interesting fact from the CDC this morning, actually, showing that there is subfertility in 7 million women aged 15 to 44, and that is 1 in every 10.9 woman struggles with becoming pregnant. And so we're seeing a lot of these similar effects in marine organisms, and usually we find similar happenings in humans. It just takes a lot longer to show the correlations there. So I think that microplastics as a source of these exposures is something that needs a lot more research, but I think it's really a problem we're going to face in the future.
Thank you, Abby. Now I'm going to ask a couple of questions. We're going to start with Leah. Can you elaborate on the complexity of our recycling system and all the different classifications of plastic?
No. It is very complex, and most it's very rare for all of those plastics. I wish that we had, is there a way to pull up that
Yeah.
slide that shows?
Back to this one.
Yes, I don't know if you can see that fine print actually from over here. I'm looking at it up on that TV screen. There's only a few categories in these classifications that can fully be recycled into the cradle-to-cradle economy that I talked about earlier, which is most of them is linear. It can't be recycled because we don't have that technology yet here in the United States, the shelves to get into consumer hands in Europe. But with regards to the complexities of recycling here in the US, I mean, I'm hearing stories like glass. You can't really find a place to recycle glass anymore because it's so heavy. You know, there's some real crisis going on with regards to our recycling systems here. I mean, I had a conversation with a woman that runs the green mission aspects of the Whole Foods in the South region, and she says, I can't find one person to take our glass waste in the South, you know, which was unheard of 15, 20 years ago. So we're at a bit of a crisis. I'm not an authority on recycling, but it's not all hunky-dory, and we need to change the systems like I described earlier with that global plastics protocol. We can't just create plastics without considering the end use. So you might have heard of extended producer responsibility. Anyone heard of that? Yeah. So it's basically, I'll just say Coca-Cola. If they create a bottle, in the old days, when it came in glass bottles, we're talking about, you know, like the 30s, 20s, or whatever, 1920s, 1930s, you would buy your Coca-Cola, take it home, and then bring your bottle back to the store, where then the distributor, the truck driver, would come and pick up the old bottles as he was dropping off the new product, take it back to the facility and wash out those bottles and refill them with Coke. That system worked great. Now, products are designed with regards, like just continuing off the Coke example, does Coca-Cola really think about whose responsibility it is to discard that plastic? Is it the government's responsibility to clean up the Coca-Cola bottle? Is it your responsibility? Is it Coca-Cola's responsibility? So there's real ethics with regards to recycling as well. A lot of considerations.
Great, thanks, Leah. Now, Abby, can you tell us some examples of how we can avoid plastic in everyday life and consumption?
Yeah, I think it's really important just to be conscious of the plastic that you're using. A lot of reusable items, or a lot of items that we use and throw away can easily be reused, like water bottles, coffee cups, shopping bags, utensils. Just be conscious of the plastic that you use. You can choose products with less packaging. A lot of people like to wrap an object in plastic and then wrap it in more plastic. So just start being aware of the plastic you encounter in everyday use. And something that I learned when I was doing my reading on microplastics is that a large source of plastics is actually in fabric. So like fleece, polyester fleece clothing, and a lot of these other like plastic fabrics shed microplastic fibers when they're washed. So maybe if you have a lot of fleece, maybe only really wash it when it starts to stink really bad, or just be conscious of the kind of fabrics you're purchasing. Like anything from like polyester is made of like polyethylene. So maybe just keep that in mind when you're shopping. And then I get asked a lot about how to avoid some of these contaminants that I talked about. And I would recommend watch what you eat. Like they say just buy everything organic. Well, I'm still a grad student. I can't afford to buy organic. So I have an app on my phone that has the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. So like I can't afford organic apples. So I eat a lot of bananas and like pineapples. So just buy organic what you can and just be aware of the rest. I always filter my water. I think that's really important. I don't know if it'll get rid of microplastics. You probably need ultra filtration to do that, but that helps. Read your labels on like personal care products. Anything with the word fragrance or paraben, or she has some examples in the back that actually contain plastic. These are really red flags. It's easy to really make your own products, like some shea butter goes a long way. Don't microwave your plastics. This really encourages the leaching of these chemicals into the environment. and dust your house. Actually, there's a lot of really nasty chemicals that, like microplastics, like absorb to dust particles. I know dusting like is the worst chore, but it helps with your exposure. So those are just some things that I keep in mind to avoid my exposure to plastics and other chemicals.
Awesome, thank you so much. And lastly, Kia, what are the impacts of microplastics in our natural environments and biological systems, and do microplastics ever completely degrade?
Okay, hard question. I guess first I'll start with impacts besides the chemical bleaching. If you're consuming, or not you, but if organisms are consuming these plastics, size-wise, these things can get clogged, right? So think of a sea turtle, that's a classic one, eating a plastic bag because it thinks it's a jellyfish. Well, once it eats the plastic bag, it can get clogged in its digestive system, cause it to suffocate. Other examples, some of these plastics, once they break apart, they become abrasive, so it could tear up the digestive system. Entanglement is an issue as well, and it's interesting to think of, okay, now we're talking about these itty bitty particles, how big a deal can they be? But there are organisms of all different size ranges. Compare it to you trying to eat your water bottle, or you trying to eat a degraded plastic milk jug that you found on the beach. Like, that doesn't go down well. And it doesn't go down well for a lot of organisms as well. So I think, and this is going to sound funny and a little cliche, but if you put yourself in their shoes, right, would you want to be eating that? And the answer is no. What things are they taking in? Oh, they're animals, it doesn't matter. That's not necessarily the way you want to think about it. And I mentioned the plastics increasing, going up the food web as well. So maybe one organism eats one little piece, and then another organism eats it, but then it eats a few other pieces of plastic, and then so on and so forth. And then once you get to the top of the food web, you got a ton of plastic inside a whale. It just doesn't work out that way. And then the other question was, how long does plastics degrade, I believe? Or how long does it take for plastic to degrade? This is an interesting question, because if you Google or look it up, they say this type of plastic takes 600 years. This type of plastic takes 200 years. But there are findings now where plastics start to degrade within a few weeks. They start to shed off little fibers. So not necessarily your clothes, but plastic bottles, etc. They start to spin off these little fibers. So not necessarily particles at this point, but little fibers within weeks. Estimates that you may read that say 600 years and stuff, that can be where it gets so small, like that whole bottle is gone. And it may not be gone. It just may be so small, the particles are so small that you can't see them anymore. So I think that's a very interesting question, and one that people are still trying to really get to the bottom of. Unless you're talking about complete chemical degradation, where you're completely changing that polymer, then they kind of never really go away. They just get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's a huge issue, and something to consider.
Thank you for that. We would now like to open the discussion to the audience if there are any questions.
We had mentioned bans, and I'd like to hear more about any local activity related to that.
I'm glad you asked that question. I am not originally from Charleston, and I feel that I should really speak about bans when there's a few experts in the room from Waterkeeper, and is Katie here from Coast? Oh, hey Katie. So Do you want to talk? Is it Shauna from Waterkeeper? Do you want to give a shot first?
Sure.
No, Katie.
Katie, okay. Katie, so I'd like to introduce Katie Zimmerman. She's with the Coastal Conservation League, and she can speak about the local ban effort going on here, as well as the gentleman who wants to ban our ability to ban.
Hi. We are, so I direct the Air, Water, and Public Health Program for the Coastal Conservation League. It's an advocacy group along coastal South Carolina. We've been working with Charleston Waterkeeper and the local chapter of Surfrider and all sorts of interested citizens on implementing these local single-use plastic bag bans. So what that means is it's not all encompassing, but it is a start. So basically at the register of retail places. So restaurants can still use them. You can always say no thanks, but basically, and also you'll see still, like Whole Foods and Earth Fare gave up voluntarily their plastic bag. You still see them in the produce section, which is a pet peeve of mine. But it's just sort of easier to get corporations to follow the law rather than, they'll say they'll do it, it's a law. But we'll try it both ways. Anyway, the city of Isle of Palms is so far the only municipality in South Carolina that has passed a single-use plastic bag ban. They're very happy about it. It seems to be going well so far. The only person on the island who objected to it was a couple that was friends with the attorney representing Novolex, which is the big plastic bag manufacturer in the country. And it was great. If you go to a website called bagtheban.com, it's an industry-sponsored website, and it's amazing. They'll try to scare you away from using reusable bags. Things like that it causes disease and they're unsanitary, and how are we ever going to carry our trash out if we don't have a plastic bag? All sorts of amazing things. And then recently, while this Isle of Palms ban was being discussed, you might, if you read the Post-Courier, you might have seen an op-ed from, I think it was the Vice President of Environmental Affairs from Novolex, submitted an op-ed and, was extolling the benefits of plastic bag use. So that bag ban passed easily. So we knew once that happened, based on what's happened in other states, that Novolex would push for a statewide ban on plastic bag bans. It's easier for them to do this at the state level than fight individually. Our lobbyist caught it a few weeks ago. It's an auxiliary container bill, which is, I still don't. I guess they were sliding it in there. But South Carolina is home to the third largest plastic bag manufacturer in the country. So there is somewhat of an argument that there are jobs associated with this product. But the companies that make these also make paper bags. They also make other types of containers. So it's not like they've got all their eggs in one plastic bag. The legislator know that this is a terrible idea. Particularly South Carolina is a home rule state, which means local government is better. So we don't want the state telling local governments what to do. The bill was scheduled for a subcommittee hearing last week and got pulled because it was also on the agenda with the Second Amendment rights bill, and legislators got so inundated with both those issues that they freaked out and pulled it. So we expect it to be back in front of the subcommittee possibly as early as next week. So I've got my cards with me, and if you want to head up to Columbia and tell the Senate or the House what you think of the bill, feel free to let me know. But also, if you haven't yet written to your representative, I can help you do that as well. If you're not a citizen of South Carolina, that's okay. You can use your help in other ways. What we'd like to see in the next year are plastic bag bans on Folly Beach, Town of James Island, Town of Mount Pleasant. Sullivan's Island has a resolution in support of businesses that don't use plastic bags. But I have a really great intern who found out that there are still businesses using them. So we've got to go back to Sullivan's and kind of help figure out how to make that better. City of Charleston is not ready for a bag ban yet, in case you're wondering why I left that out. But we are working on that behind the scenes. There was an article recently in the paper talking about a new council member who's going to put forward a plastic bag ban, and that would have died immediately. It wasn't very helpful. So we'll get there. I can use your help on all sorts of grassroots stuff, and if that was long enough, but there's a lot going on with plastic bag bans in South Carolina.
Introduce yourself real quick.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Kermack. I work for Charleston Waterkeeper. I've been working with Katie on this issue, and I was just going to say one thing Katie mentioned. If you haven't contacted your representative, please do so. And I have some form letters if anybody's interested in signing, and we can figure out who your representative is. Just give your address to find me after. And you can look up on our website if you have any more questions. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions?
Comment. My background is marine sciences. I do shellfish for 13 years in Montauk, New York, and oysters, clams, and bay scallops. And so for our oysters, we actually moved from using an oyster shell, it was like a 1/4 inch to set our larvae onto, to what they were calling a microculture. So we would actually seal the oyster shell to get it so that it was just a little bit larger than the oyster larvae when they were ready to set. The interesting thing about that was it actually allowed us to grow a lot more oysters, because with the other way, the oysters tend to be very communal when they set, because they're going to not be able to move anymore, and they want to be close to each other for reproduction. So those larger pieces would sometimes have like 200 oysters on them, but then as they grew, they would basically outcompete each other. So the microculture is a much better way. I was just thinking in terms of that area that you're talking about in the fresh is meeting the estuary, and how perhaps there might actually be some potential positives, like you mentioned, for shellfish anyway, in terms of providing habitat for the larvae to be actually setting on, and then that's also removing that small stuff from the waste stream. Just thoughts. And the other thing is I'm working on a warehouse space in Harrisburg. Falling down. I've been taking plastic bottles out, catching rainwater that's coming into the roof, making gardens, trying to show basically how people with no money can take things and use them right away, and use buildings that have fallen down to try to turn these things around.
Use what you got.
Yeah.
I do have one.
Okay. Yeah. I have like a section for last minute things. Is there any more questions? We have time for one more. Okay, then if each of the panelists would like to give some final thoughts about the topic, we can start with Leah.
Why, thank you. I did want to mention with the recycling comment, I forgot to add something about the importance of the price of oil to drive recycling, especially in developing countries, because I just got on the phone with a gentleman yesterday that is working with waste pickers in India. And because the price of oil is so low, they're not finding any recycling markets for a lot of their normal products, like bottles and bottle caps and things, because people find it cheaper to use virgin plastic, because it's a little more expensive to recycle plastics. So I forgot to mention that international comment. To close.
Make a quick comment on that?
Yes, please.
That's actually happening here in Charleston now. I don't know if you all knew, but our MRF, or Materials Recovery Facility, shut down. And I am a facilities coordinator, person responsible for finding places to send our recycling. I had to figure out what to do with it all. That is largely a product of single stream recycling and of contamination in recycling. So if this is an issue that's close to your heart, one thing that you can do is to make sure that you know what you're doing with our recycling, that you're putting things where they should go. If you don't know, we have zerowaste.csu.edu to help you find out what to do with it. And
So thank you so much. In closing, I actually want to challenge each of you, because it's really easy, if you think about it, to just focus in on one way you can eliminate plastic in your lives. And I would look at you all and say, can you take a 30-day challenge? 30-day pledge to not use a single-use plastic water bottle or soda bottle. 30-day challenge to not use a straw. And encourage your friends to, and make a game of it. Go online and see what you can do if you can outlast each other. on the back table before you leave, I left some coasters that we printed up that are designed for when you guys go out. We're not condoning drinking or anything like that, but when you guys are going out to a restaurant and your server automatically puts some water in front of you with a straw, you know, hand them this coaster, leave this coaster behind, because it talks about why straws are so bad. We use 500 million straws a day in the United States. Straws aren't recyclable. It's a single stream thing. So whenever I sit down to get a, have for dinner, I basically am like, water, no straw. And I encourage you guys to do the same. These little changes can really make a big difference if you can create a movement to do that.
Closing message. Kind of to go along with that, not only reduce your use of it or your purchasing of plastics, but if you're walking down the street and see a candy wrapper, pick it up. Like, it takes 2 seconds out of your day to pick it up and put it where it needs to go. I think we have this mentality, and I'm not looking at anybody in particular or anything like that, but just as a culture, we have this mentality that, oh, I didn't put it there, it's not my problem. And that's not the case. Hopefully, as you gathered from this whole panel, that it could be your problem, and it will be your problem. They're talking about how to define the Anthropocene, which is the age of humans, and they threw out using nuclear traces as an example, and also plastics. Well, one day archaeologists are going to come around and dig and find this layer of plastic. That's not something we want. That's not something that we want our legacy to be. We don't want to destroy something that we love. You don't want to go kayaking with your friends and see a river full of plastic. And that's not cool. That's not pretty. So just be cognizant, be thoughtful, if you see somebody throw trash, say something. Don't be rude or mean about it. Just say, hey, you dropped that, it might have been an accident, but could you please pick that up? Or actually there's a trash can over there, or, or say something. Don't just let it go unnoticed.
Okay, and from the cellular side of things, I guess my closing remark would be, I actually went to the EPA website to see what they had to say about microplastics. And they're usually pretty conservative when it comes to regulating. But they actually said, this kind of sums up everything I mentioned. Microplastics have the potential to both sorb and desorb chemicals in the marine environment. And these chemicals may be persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. And a lot more research needs to be done. We don't exactly know the scale of the effect these chemicals and these microplastics are going to have on our public health, but just based on the sheer volume of these chemicals, it is really alarming. So I would like to say thank you for being here, because education and awareness is like the first step into solving this problem. So thanks to you guys for coming and being interested.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah, Abby, and Kia, for taking the time to participate in this event. And thank you everyone who helped make this event possible. If you could now take a second and fill out those green note cards that were handed to you in the beginning, and write down a sentence or a couple words about what you learned or how you felt about this event, that would be greatly appreciated. Just so you know, this upcoming Friday at 2, we have a do-it-yourself face wash event. If you want to make a new face wash that is microplastic free, and if you would like to have more information about that, you can go see Caitlin, who is sitting at that back table over there, and sign up or ask her more about that. Thank you so much all for coming today.